Okay, so it should now be recording. I also have a survey that I will pop in the chat box, so please fill out the survey to help us determine future webinar topics and also to let us know how we're doing. So today's topic will be about climate change, and we have two great climate change specialists here today, but first I wanted to highlight a few upcoming events we have. So we have another part of the series, which is in November, since these are bi-monthly webinars, and it's Forestry for the Birds. We have Jared Elm from the Ruffed Grouse Society and Dwayne Foggard from the American Bird Conservancy to talk about how your backyard can help local birds. And that is same day, so Wednesdays at 1:30, same time on November 18th. And you can go to St. Croix River Association and look at our calendar, or I will also make sure to pop these links in the chat when I'm done talking. There's also, in 2 weeks, the Minnesota Woodland Owner Weekend. So this is usually done in person, but this year it will be virtual. It's on October 3rd, which is a Saturday, and they have two great keynote speakers. They have Lee Frelick from the University of Minnesota and also Douglas Talamy, who is the author of Bringing Nature Home. So I'll be sure to pop those links if you want to register for any of those events. All right, so our first speaker today will be Gabriel Burns, who is with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry. At the division, he is involved in developing a climate change program, drafting division-level guidance on climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies, and estimating carbon stock and stock changes based on forest management activities. Before joining the DNR, he was with a consulting firm in Germany, but now resides in his hometown, Minneapolis. And Gabriel, I will stop sharing my screen and let you have control.
All right, thank you, Nicole. All right, so let me share. Let me know when you see it.
Yes, I can see the presentation.
Yep, thank you. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again, Nicole, for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Gabriel Burns, and I'm a climate change specialist with the Minnesota DNR. Today, I'm going to talk about the role of forests in climate change mitigation, as well as some of the kind of emerging opportunities for small, non-industrial private forest landowners in the carbon market space. So as an overview, first we'll kind of look, kind of frame up the issue looking at greenhouse gas emissions, sources and sinks, and then look more closely at the role of forests and some of the key forest management strategies which have been identified that can effectively enhance biosequestration of atmospheric CO2. Then we'll look kind of at a snapshot of private forest landowners, background and the potential role they have in contributing towards climate change mitigation. Then I'll delve a little into carbon markets and what a forest carbon offset project entails. And lastly, we'll look at some of the kind of the emerging opportunities in terms of projects and programs within a voluntary carbon market. So first, this first graph shows greenhouse gas emissions kind of by major sector. And I would, whoops, it's odd. This is missing some of the, isn't that bizarre? Okay, well, I have it committed to memory, so I'm not quite sure why this is not showing all of the kind of details on this graph, but I would just draw your attention to kind of the right side of the graph where I have these different pieces broken out. And the largest contributor towards emissions is the electricity generation sector, so burning of coal, oil, and use of natural gas. But closely and almost to the same magnitude as contributor is the food and land use sector, which is, I think, oftentimes a surprise to people. And that should say 24%. So it's almost, the same in terms of contribution towards global emissions. And what stands out in food and land use is deforestation and land clearing for food production, which is predominantly the largest driver of emissions kind of within this sector. And yeah, I bring that up because I think it's often a surprise to people. And so when we look at the what's considered the AFLU sector, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, we see a lot of kind of opportunities that are starting to arise in terms of reducing emissions as well as kind of increasing CO2 removals. Next to that is methane emissions and nitrous oxide from over-fertilization of agriculture. And this is, oftentimes these are, or I should say, they are reported as kind of their CO2 equivalents, and they're given this kind of global warming potential. So when we look at these, kind of their potency as it lines up in CO2, methane is about 28 times the potency of CO2, and N2O, or nitrous oxide, is about 265 times the global warming potential. So very significant in terms of greenhouse gases. So next, we look here at the kind of fate of CO2 emissions. So the majority, 46%, ends up in the atmosphere. Over here where it's not shown is 23% is absorbed into the ocean sink, and roughly a third is absorbed into terrestrial vegetation and soils. So again, as we focus in on the land base, we can see this kind of real potential to enhance biosequestration through how we manage our land base kind of within this AFLU sector. Next, we'll look kind of a little more deeply at the role of forests. So kind of focusing on the, carbon benefits. So the key forest management strategies which have really been identified, which can kind of help us enhance sequestration of CO2. And the other thing that I don't cover in this presentation, which is kind of very important, are these non-carbon or co-benefits, and which often result from some type of sustainable forest management activity. And I think this draws the attention of a lot of kind of private forest landowners, because this is, it's a little more tangible. Carbon is one of those things that you talk about and it's related to climate change. However, the non-carbon benefits such as wildlife habitat, aesthetic beauty, water quality, improvement of water and air quality, these types of things I know are kind of inherent values of a lot of private forest landowners. And they are typically the result of some kind of sustainable management intervention. So, and I know they've also gained much more attraction in the voluntary market, and certain projects, although it's kind of in a pilot phase, are starting to see payouts for these as well. So here, I've kind of broken out some of the broad strategies, which I just mentioned before, which are kind of natural climate solution approaches to addressing climate change. So the first one, keeping forests as forests, and this is kind of a really big one. Following the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they talk about the need and the impact of basically avoiding deforestation or any type of land use conversion. That report tends to be a little more weighted towards the global south, where the magnitude of deforestation is kind of unprecedented compared to the US, but it's still very much relevant here. And for us, in terms of keeping forests as forests and pro-forestation, avoiding forest fragmentation, also very important. This can also be related to increasing the stocking in degraded forests, but there's many other kind of activities that fall under this. Next, improve forest management. This IFM is also very much become a way of effectively enhancing sequestration, and ultimately, the goal being increasing both above and below ground biomass, and how it relates to carbon stocks. So this is also something, and coincidentally, this is very much, or all these are related to the voluntary carbon market in terms of forest carbon offset project types. Next, we look at afforestation and reforestation. And this has also gained a lot of media attention recently. So when people kind of idly think about, well, how can we mitigate climate change? Well, let's go out and plant a ton of trees, which is definitely a good solution, but it's a little more complicated than meets the eye than just going out to plant a ton of trees, because ultimately you need to find the land base where you can plant trees. And so this becomes a little more complicated, but very relevant. And then lastly, the fate of some of the timber that we're harvesting. So kind of the long-term carbon storage that ends up in our forest products. And this has also gained a lot of attention recently. So when you think about mass timber or cross-laminated timber, these everything that can really store carbon in the built environment. And so a lot of attention is being drawn towards this. And this was just to give an example. This was a legislative request, and so we kind of looked at where, in terms of meeting some of our Next Generation Energy Act goals for the state of Minnesota, how can we contribute towards this? And so this is just a little exercise that I did, looking primarily at Forest Service, FIA, which is the Forest Inventory and Analysis database. Where can we, essentially implement a tree planting project in order to contribute about, roughly 5 million tons CO2 equivalent in carbon removed. And so we looked at this and found about 20,000 acres of kind of medium to low stock forests over about a 50-year time horizon that would accomplish this goal. So now we look at kind of the background of private forest landowners, and a lot of this was taken from American Forest Foundation summary, 3-region summary, and this is just a bit of a synopsis of that. So the first point, collectively, family forest owners have a huge potential in mitigating climate change because they account for about 36% of the forested land base. So it's a very large slice of the pie. Kind of the size of forest ownership ranges from about 10 to 5,000 acres, about 80% of which surveyed participants have less than 1,000 acres, and average parcel size about 67 acres. And according to the U.S. Forest Service Woodland survey, kind of the top 3 reasons family forest owners own land is to sustain wildlife and nature, maintain inherent beauty, and have kind of continued family legacy. And to add, a lot of the kind of small, non-industrial private forest landowners are middle-class Americans, which, when you think about the potential to get these landowners involved, it gives you an objective. And over 86% when surveyed say they want to keep their forest lands forested, and over 83% want to improve the health of their forest land. However, given all that information, there has been a lot of kind of barriers in implementing some of these sustainable forest management project interventions. First, many private forest owners are kind of unsure about selecting the right forest management activities, as well as the available resources, and this could be through land managing agencies or a carbon market framework. And when provided with options, when they do have those options, costs essentially can be kind of the largest barrier to implementing any of these types of activities. And kind of a lateral step now, carbon market opportunities, which I know have definitely gained, they've been around for several decades, but more recently have gained a lot of attention, especially in the private sector for private forest landowners. But they've been hard to implement, basically, a lot because, or people have been deterred to kind of entering into them because of the complexity, time commitments, and costs. So next we'll look a little at how they actually work. So in terms of setting up a forest carbon offset project, first you need to come up with some kind of a project concept note. And this is important because essentially what they do is they look at the feasibility of would this project be able to exist in the absence of some type of carbon finance. So first and foremost, what they have to determine is it feasible to implement some type of forest carbon project. Next, you kind of write a project description. And this is really the blueprint for the project that would be implemented. So the project type, if it's an improved forest management project, or if it's an afforestation, reforestation project. But this really kind of lays out the blueprint, and you have to develop a monitoring plan. And traditionally you do this kind of ex ante, which is a fancy way of saying these modeled carbon stock changes through a baseline scenario or a business as usual practice. And then that project description needs to be validated by what's called a VVB. It's a validation verification body. And I think when people start to look at the costs of getting a lot of these projects, well, first off the ground, but the costs that are oftentimes the MRV costs, so contracting out to a consulting firm to actually start doing this is really what starts to deter people, because it can get pretty expensive. But the project description needs to be validated. Following that, the emission reductions need to be verified. So looking at the registered PD that details how to track and report the GHG emission reductions and kind of other data relevant to the project. And finally, project proponents submit a request to register their project and issue offset credits into a registry account. And so this is really at the step where you are issued some type of offset credit. And traditionally, people have worked with brokers to find people who can actually purchase these. But I would just point out now too that something that's really come to the surface is that there's more and more people who are looking towards local corporations to develop contractually what are called emission reduction purchase agreements. So you can essentially set up an end buyer, which they could actually finance a project, but they can also purchase the credits, because on a voluntary market, there's not really a spatial boundary in terms of people who can actually buy these things. And so I think one of the real pushes recently is to try to keep things much more local. So if it's in the state of Minnesota or the state of Wisconsin. So looking at this, forest carbon offset project, one of the big kind of central pieces to it is what's called additionality. And you can see over on the right side that it has to be real, it has to be additional, and it has to be permanent. So additionality, really what it says is that you have to basically show, as it's drawn up in the project description, that there is carbon stock changes, or which is to say there's going to be emission reductions or removals above a baseline scenario. So essentially what you're doing is you have to prove that there is going to be an increase in biomass at a landscape scale or within the project boundary. Only then is it really considered additional. And this is kind of the centerpiece of how these projects work. It has to be real, which is to say it has to exist, and it has to be permanent. And a lot of these projects have kind of different safeguards in place which address permanence or any type of activity shifting leakage. And really what it means to say is that we need to make sure that following the end of a project timeline, or when the project actually comes to a close, that somebody can't just go in and slick all the timber off their land. So this is just an overview, kind of an overview of decadal trends in the carbon market. So kind of over the last 10 years, volume of projects have been relatively stable. However, in the last couple of years, they've seen this huge increase in kind of volume of projects in the voluntary carbon market. with 130% increase in total project volume, with roughly 50%, 56% of the market share in that kind of within the AFLU sector. So again, this agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So this has really gained kind of a lot of attention, and the volume of projects coming through has increased pretty substantially. The other thing, there's been emergence of this what's called CORSIA. It's the carbon offset and reduction reduction scheme in international aviation, and they've really again looked towards the easiest answer is kind of in the land use sector for emission reductions and removals. And although the last accounting year saw this kind of exponential increase in project volume, average offset prices have remained relatively flat. But then you can see here some of the pricing on per ton CO2 of carbon. And this avoided conversion, I would just say, is no longer called that. It's RED, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is a lot of these different accounting standards. It's you know, the largest part of their portfolio has to do with these RED projects, which take place in the global south. So now we'll kind of look at some of the emerging opportunities for private forest landowners. I see I'm kind of running short on time. So this, the American Carbon Forest Initiative, this is really kind of the three major programs that are starting to address some of these issues, especially when I was talking about the barriers to action. And you know, what I'll draw your attention to, first of all, is that some of these are in their pilot phases. They're just kind of, you know, working through the details in terms of developing the methodologies that are going to be appropriate to this. And some of them, however, have been kind of implemented at the project level. So first of all, you can see here, the project size, eligible land size is anywhere from about 10 to 2,000 acres. Correlated to that, the number of landowners per project, this is where it gets pretty interesting, because now essentially the idea that they're introducing is kind of aggregating a cluster of different landowners to kind of create, you know, this conterminous boundary that would be part of a forest carbon offset project. So essentially you can have yourself and your neighbor start to sign up for some of these projects, and yeah, you know, kind of reap the benefits of entering into a carbon market scheme, and you know, eventually generating offset credits and selling them. So in these two, so the landowner payments for two of these projects, it's after credits have been sold. So once they actually kind of reach that final stage and they've been registered and they can, you know, be sold in the voluntary market. And this one is before the Family Forest Carbon Program is one that they're offering payments up front. And again, this isn't a pilot phase, but I know that there's been a lot of kind of outside funding into this to kind of help perfect the program and to you know, anticipate a lot of people being able to be involved in this. The other thing that's kind of mandatory with all these is that there needs to be some type of you know, third-party program, you know, like a forest legacy program or a conservation easement. And again, it's the safeguard against activity shifting leakage. And so when the project period comes to an end, there's some kind of safeguard in place, which continues to essentially protect these forested lands under some type of, you know, whether it's a conservation easement or a forest legacy program, to ensure that they'll continually continually be managed sustainably, kind of in perpetuity. Almost at the end here. So this is one that I just would talk about briefly. This is related to the Family Forest Carbon Project. And this is a new improved forest management IFM methodology that it's in the public commenting period right now. But the reason I wanted to bring this up, I know this is a bit text heavy, but it's rather interesting because typically in these projects, when you have the baseline and project scenario, the baseline oftentimes has to be modeled using these kind of yield and growth models and allometric equations. And oftentimes what comes with that is a lot of uncertainty. In this new methodology, what they take is these composite control plots, which rely on forest inventory and analysis data, which is from the US Forest Service. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about this recently, and this is actually now kind of being worked into this methodology. So essentially what you get is this paired sample approach where you have a treatment plot and a composite control plot where you're essentially have this dynamic baseline, which every time those plots, those permanent sample plots are remeasured, it's updated, and this is public data. And I won't go kind of too far into the weeds with this, but essentially it creates more accuracy and reduces costs, which is really great. And I think that's one of the kind of the goals as to why they're using this as an approach in this methodology. And so the other thing about this is it's not entirely prescriptive, but you can you have to essentially elect some kind of forest management activity, again, that's going to show the increase in biomass within the project boundary. So some of these enrichment plantings, release of natural regen through management of competing vegetation, reducing timber harvest levels, extending rotations, etc. But again, it's not entirely prescriptive as it says in the methodology, but rather you just need to show that there is a change in activity, and that change in activity is going to essentially increase biomass above and below ground, and subsequently the carbon within the project boundary. So I think I'm a bit over time here, but lastly, I guess what I would say is private forest landowners are a very essential part of this, kind of helping to address climate change mitigation in the United States. And a lot of what's emerging, especially in the voluntary carbon market within the U.S., is looking at these smaller non-industrial private forest landowners. And so the methodologies, the projects and programs that are emerging right now are really to help kind of address the barriers, the issues that have always kind of faced these, average kind of American families that owned private forest lands. And, as I spoke with Stephen really briefly before the call, and I was just letting him know that we have now this essentially a task team within the state, which is going to really start to look at the role of the DNR actually will in kind of helping set up these projects and any of the MRV work. And this is again, in a pilot phase, but there's a lot of this that's kind of coming to the surface now. And it really, again, the objective is to really scale up our efforts in kind of increasing emission reductions and removals at a landscape scale. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Gabriel. That was really great information. Before we begin our next presentation, I want to remind everyone that if they have questions, please use the chat box, which can be found below, and we'll have a Q&A at the very end. Stephen, if you want to go ahead and get yourself situated with your presentation, I can introduce you. So our next presenter today is Stephen Handler with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, also known as NIACS. His main role with NIACS is to coordinate the Northwoods Climate Change Response Framework. Stephen is located in Michigan and loves being a Youper, if I said that correctly.
Got it. Okay, thanks, Nikki. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to speak today. I'm turning my webcam on just in case that makes this a little more interesting and a little less tempting to drift off into the other room or go check your email. I'm going to try to make this quick and save some time for Q&A at the end. So without delay, Nikki mentioned our group, NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I tell people we're basically like a climate change help desk or a climate change phone a friend service for foresters and land managers and landowners all across the Midwest and Northeastern United States. So we are built to be specifically a technical assistance provider on these topics of climate change risk, adaptation, and also carbon management. So if you're not familiar with us, I'd encourage you to go visit niacs.org and learn a little more. And so I don't think I have to really answer this question since you all signed up for this webinar, but just in case, you know, oftentimes I wonder, or people may wonder why we're talking about climate change and forests when there are so many other stressors and risks and challenges out there to our forests. And very simply, I make the case that we know that forests provide us many values and benefits, and we don't have to argue about which of these benefits are most important, because they'll have, you know, different different rankings for different landowners and different agencies. But whether it's a legacy you're passing on to your kids, habitat for wildlife, clean water, places to recreate and relax, or an engine for our region's economy, I think we can agree that forests are immensely valuable to us and our identities in this place. And climate change has the potential to shift and stress all of these values. So regardless of what your priority is here, there's a very compelling reason to start paying attention to, or continue paying attention to, climate change risks and how it may affect our forests and the places we care about. And in case you're wondering how popular this notion is among landowners, and private landowners in particular, there's some new work out there that's starting to highlight this. So this is survey data from a researcher at the University of Michigan. She sent out surveys to thousands and got 1,200 responses back to private landowners across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. These are folks who own 10 acres or more of forest land. She asked them a number of questions, but she had a subset of questions focused on climate change. And the results here were pretty astonishing to me. You see overwhelming majorities of private landowners, private forest landowners, agreeing that the climate is changing, that our activities contribute, and that forests play a role, and that forest management plays a role. Okay, so this is, you know, this is the baseline now. This is where the public is. So if you are a consulting forester and wondering if your clients buy into this, or if they're ready to talk about climate change risks, chances are that they're ready and they're waiting for you to talk to them about it. Where are we going today in the next 20 minutes? I'm going to give maybe the shortest ever recap of climate change in the Northwoods. I'll just do a brief overview of climate impacts to forests. And then I'll spend most of my time talking about a couple new resources that our team has developed and that might be useful to you, whether you are a forester or a landowner in this part of the world. I won't have time to go into everything under the sun on climate change, but there are a whole bevy of resources out there that will be useful to you if you want to take a deeper dive. First of all, our group has developed these climate change vulnerability assessments for forests in different parts of the Midwest. And so we have two assessments here that might be useful to you depending on which side of the state line you fall on. And we have separate assessments for northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin forests. And the links here are on the screen. So I'd encourage you to dive into those if you want some good after dinner reading. Folks in Minnesota, the DNR has now a really useful climate change website that includes short snippets and storylines of how climate change is playing out in the state. Some different testimonials that talk about different ways that climate change is already affecting our lives. And then they have this really great data dashboard where you can slice and dice the state based on watersheds or counties or climate divisions. And you can pull up this information yourselves to see how has the climate already changed in the seasons that I care about. You can look up different variables. So all of this now is at your fingertips, and you can do this investigation for the places you live and the places you care about. Those of you who are badgers, Wisconsin is not to be discounted here. You guys have a great resource that is Wiki, the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. If you're not familiar with Wiki, definitely go to their website as well. They're kind of a hub of climate change information for all of the different sectors in Wisconsin. So they have a forestry group, they have an infrastructure group, they have a water resources group. And if you dig into this, you will find loads of useful handouts and summaries. They have also a really nice data dashboard and maps of observed and future projected change across the state. And climate vulnerability assessments for ecosystems that you might care about in addition to forests. So if you're wondering about wetlands, for example, they've got climate vulnerability assessments for those as well. So my very brief climate change tour. What's happening in our region? What have we already observed? I talk about just a few main headlines from climate change in our part of the world. And the first is this one, that winters are warming the fastest. This hopefully is not a surprise to you and shouldn't be a surprise if you've lived in this part of the world for a while now, but winter is where the action is. It's where most of the warming is. I'm showing you a map of Wisconsin that shows in the last 70 or so years, we've already experienced 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit of warming in the months of December, January, and February. That is the astonishing rate of change. The little polygons with asterisks show you where that trend is statistically significant. And what you're seeing here is in every NOAA climate division across the state, we're seeing significant warming in the winter. Very different storyline, for example, in the summer, and especially when you look at summer maximum temperatures. That's what I'm showing you here on the right. So June, July, August maximum temperatures. And really we're seeing kind of a wash, slight increases, not statistically significant. So a very different storyline. Winter is really where the action is. The second main headline of change that I talk to people about in our part of the world is we're getting more and more of our rain in these big, heavy events. And again, many of you have probably lived through one or more of these storms in the last 5 years. This isn't, you know, groundbreaking. You've already lived through it. But I'm showing you figures here that show just rainstorms that are 3 inches or more. And these are broken down by decades. So 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the first decade of the 2000s. This doesn't include any of the recent storms in the last 10 years. And so we know this trend has just accelerated over the past decade. More of our precipitation's coming in these big, heavy events. And that has dramatic consequences, as we know, for our lives, our infrastructure, and our ecosystems. And even if we didn't have thermometers, even if we didn't have rain gauges, there are many other lines of evidence to let us know that change is occurring and that our ecosystems are starting to respond to that change. So whether you are paying attention to things like flowering dates or leaf out dates, or dates when ice is coming off and on lakes, or migration dates, seasonal events like migratory waterfowl. There's clear evidence from all of those cyclical events that happen around the calendar that change is occurring and our seasons are shifting. So the natural world is starting to respond to these climate changes. For one example, a long-time series of leaf out dates in the Twin Cities has already documented that leaves are coming out about a week earlier over the past 40 years. And the USDA has just recently had to redraw the map of hardiness zones across the United States to account for these dramatic changes in winter severity, basically. And this matters to you if you are planting tomatoes or plum trees in your yard, but it also really matters to you if you are a insect that has been kept out of those juicy northern forests for a long time because they have been too cold in the wintertime. Well, now some of that barrier has been relaxed, and I might be able to get up there and get a foothold, or I might be able to complete more life cycles. in a season. So this matters for forests. So what does this mean for our woods? I'm going to be really cruel here. This is just going to be a very quick teaser because I want to be sure we save time for our resources and questions. But basically, the story is that we don't expect climate change to be a mass catastrophe and to cause widespread mortality all at once. That is not the situation that we're asking people to prepare for. We don't intend people to expect that. Instead, we grabbed this term actually from the military. This is how the Department of Defense describes climate change, as a threat multiplier. And it's this idea that stress and change and disturbance can change interactions, and that ecosystems respond differently when they're under multiple stressors at one time. So if you get these heavy precipitation events and you're not able to recharge your soil's moisture, well, you may actually be experiencing more drought stress throughout the year. And then drought stress might not be alone enough to damage a forest, but if you take that and lay on top a pest outbreak that maybe is worse than it otherwise would have been because you've got new pests and potentially larger populations of those pests, well, now you're starting to see these cascading impacts feeding off of each other. So that's this idea of a threat multiplier. And when we worked to put together those climate change vulnerability assessments that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we worked with teams of experts from academia, from national forests, from state agencies, private industry and private consulting foresters, tribes that manage forest land. So we had a diversity of viewpoints and expertise around the same table, looking at climate change trends and information. And we together worked on drawing conclusions on what's most at risk and what's likely to change in our woods. And these were the storylines, these were the impacts that kept coming up again and again in different forest types across Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so I'm putting these here just as a prompt. So this is a list of impacts. I'll ask you now to think of any that maybe you're not familiar with, or maybe you'd like to hear a little more about, and save that for the Q&A period. Because I'm going right along, and you can get more information about all of these in the other resources that I mentioned. Okay, so very quick climate change primer, background information. But now, the exciting stuff that you guys came here for, new tools and resources. Okay, so our group is trying to make this information more available and more useful all the time. A couple resources that I want to share with you today that we think will make it easier to digest and put this information into practice. You can get these resources yourselves at our website, forestadaptation.org. Go here under this Learn tab, and you'll be able to search through all of these. I'm also going to pull up the chat window, and I'm going to put these resources right now, direct links in the chat screen. Okay, bear with me one second. So the first two links are there, and those are for these pocket-sized climate change field guides. And these are spiral bound, 4 by 6 inch little, actually pocket guides. They do fit in pockets, we tested them. And what these are designed to do is to put this information at your fingertips. We know people are not carrying around our lovely 250-page vulnerability assessments, although it gives me great pain to admit that. But what you've got here is short synopsis of key climate change impacts for each one you'll find kind of a top 10 list of key climate impacts for northern Minnesota or northern Wisconsin forests. You will find information breakdowns by forest type. So if you're in Minnesota, you get the forested native plant communities, a system adopted by the Minnesota DNR and others for classifying forest ecosystems. In Wisconsin, you get cover types like aspen, birch, northern hardwoods, white pine, red pine. So you can quickly flip to whatever forest type or cover type you happen to be walking around in or that you care about. You can get a quick summary of the characteristics of that system, what it requires to maintain its identity, some of the key facts and risk factors, some of the ways our expert panel thought that climate change could affect that specific forest type. You get a breakdown of tree species projections that are important for that forest type. So we have models that tell us, well, do we expect a species like red maple to increase or decrease in this whole geography in the future because of climate change? So you get a sense to look at how the different species might play out individually. So that's fast facts that you get about climate change in general and specific forest types. We also try to put some considerations in front of you to get you thinking about, well, what's specific and different about my property or the place I happen to be walking, because we know climate change is going to play out differently across the landscape. So in each forest type, you'll find here a kind of a customized checklist of site level considerations. And what we do is basically we list some key topics that we think are going to be very influenced by climate change. And we give you kind of a risk factor or a spectrum of risk, and you get to decide, well, do I happen to be on the low side of climate change risk here, or am I on the high side? You can make that assessment yourselves and give yourself then maybe a more customized assessment of how risky am I compared to other northern hardwood stands or other aspen birch stands that might be on the landscape. Okay, so that was resource number 1. Resource number 2 goes a little further into this question of what's specific about my property or this one place that I happen to be working. Because we find that this is where landowners and foresters have a lot of questions. How can we take these general expectations about climate change and how can we drill down, and how can I think specifically about this forest management plan that I'm writing for this individual property? So to help people think about that, and specifically to help private landowners think about that, we have created these two what we call private landowner scorecards. And I'm putting in the links here for Wisconsin version and Minnesota version. We worked with University of Minnesota Extension and University of Wisconsin Extension to produce these. That's why they're separate, so that each extension office can use them and post them separately. But what these do is, for a landowner who might not be used to thinking about climate change, it can be a little overwhelming. It's hard to think about, multiple cascading impacts all at once. And so we try to break it down in a systematic fashion for people. And so we present a series of scorecards with some simple factors to consider. And again, you get to place yourself on a spectrum of high risk to low risk for each of these factors. And the idea is that each scorecard where you are assessing risk, different scorecards focus on, property level considerations or specific features like diversity, structure, regeneration. And each scorecard leads to a companion set of actions that you could take. So if you do find yourself in a high risk situation, we also provide some suggestions of things you might consider to reduce that risk, or to, to play around. And so some of the things that are in these scorecards, just if you want a quick tour. So for example, in a scorecard on forest diversity, we're asking people to think about species diversity, species suitability, that is, how many of these species are expected to be winners versus losers under climate change. General tree health, so do you have other forest health issues for particular species? Pests and diseases. And then finally, landscape diversity. So how does your property compare to the surrounding landscape, and does it provide some unique diversity when you take a look beyond your properties? And you get a quick look here at some of the factors in the structure scorecard, the regeneration scorecard, and finally some of those property level considerations. So am I on soils that are particularly prone to drought stress? Am I in a landscape position where I'm going to be really affected by heavy rainfall? Am I in a high deer population area on the landscape? Some things like that to consider. So again, that scorecard it's designed to help you as a landowner think a little more concretely about your property. Or if you're a consulting forester, maybe it can help start that conversation that you've been wanting to have with a private landowner and kind of ease them into this. Hey, I notice you have these things happening on your property. These are some ways we can adapt and prepare because of those factors. So get that stuff at our website. I put the links in the chat box. And that is my very quick tour. So please email me if you have questions or if you want to do follow up on any of that stuff.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Gabriel and Stephen, for speaking with us today. Climate change is something that's always on my mind, so I appreciate you talking about some of the tools and resources that we can potentially do something about it. So if you haven't done so already, please feel free to type your questions. I see we have a few of them up right now. So I will moderate the questions. We may not be able to get to them all, but if we didn't get to your question, feel free to email me or the presenters directly. All right, so let us start with Gabriel to give Stephen a break. What are the approximate upfront costs of enrolling in a forest carbon credit program?
Yeah, so I can give you a pretty wide range, and this is some of this information I get from Ecosystem Marketplace. They do a annual state of the voluntary carbon market. This is where I kind of gather a lot of this data. But typically in the voluntary market, it can be anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 plus the average costs of VVBs, which is this verification validation body, which is part of the rules and requirements of any forest carbon project or any carbon project, can be about $45,000. And then you have registry fees. So it can be kind of expensive, and this is really what a lot of the conversations that emerged out of this is exactly for this reason. When you start to look at these costs, it deters people, and the complexity and the time commitments. And so one thing that I kind of forgot to mention, which is that a project can run anywhere from 20 to 100 years, depending. And that's across both the voluntary and compliance market. Compliance markets are just 100 years. But that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to, so they've developed projects and methodologies which reduce time commitments and find other ways of addressing these costs, which sometimes it can be you use some of the carbon finance to essentially pay for some of the costs. And there's a lot more to it, and I won't get in the weeds, but I hope that answered your question.
Great. We have one question about listing off the slices at the very beginning, since it was cut off, but maybe we could, is it okay to send like those few slides in an email to those who came today?
Yeah, absolutely. I will send those. Should I send those to you?
Yeah, and then I can
Okay.
send it to everyone who
Yep.
attended. All
I'd
right.
be happy to do so.
Great, thank you. Here's a question for Stephen. Are there any good resources for Michigan?
No, why would we do anything for Michigan? Yes, we have similar beefy climate change vulnerability assessments for forests in northern Michigan. We also have one of those private landowner scorecard checklists for folks in Michigan that Michigan State University Extension helped put together. And I'd be happy to email those out.
Okay, and then this is kind of going along that same theme. Do you have those pocket size field guides for Northeast and New England? Let's just include like other areas too.
Right now, Minnesota and Wisconsin are really special because they're the only states that we have those spiral bound field guides. We are working on one right now for southern Wisconsin. So pretty soon we'll have the whole state of Wisconsin covered. If you're in New England, my coworker, Maria Genoviak, has really nice resources. She has like a private landowner scorecard for landowners in New England as well. So there are some companion resources like that, but not the spiral bound field guides.
Okay, great. Gabriel, you mentioned that the Minnesota DNR might play a role in helping to connect landowners to carbon markets. Can you say more about what this might look like and then what services might be offered?
Yeah, sure. And this is in a very kind of preliminary phase, and it has to do with some kind of bipartisan bills that were recently introduced in legislation: a Growing Climate Solutions Act, Rural Forests Markets Act. And so this, again, being that this is really kind of in its preliminary phase, we were looking at, essentially how can, which I touched on before, how can these projects be funded? So how can we reduce the largest barrier for private forest landowners, which is typically cost? And if that's going to be through some type of tax incentive program or some type of funding, which can really help, create the carbon finance for these types of projects. And then it's twofold, also the kind of providing the technical assistance. So a lot of what is oftentimes contracted out to consulting foresters, is there a way that we can provide this type of technical support to some of these private forest landowners? So if it's, in terms of writing the project design document, kind of getting a project essentially set up. So doing the GIS exercise and kind of then looking at the monitoring plan and even, helping with some of those costs. Of course, they need to be funded to some degree, but really, and I think what I mentioned before, which is like, we need to get creative here too. I'd say we're in a bit of a pickle, and I think that a lot of these corporate, there's this idea of charismatic carbon. So a lot of these large corporations, I think that especially on a local level, we can really start looking to them to help fund some of these projects and programs. That's kind of my opinion, but we're sharing.
Okay, great. Another question is, can you compare upland versus lowland wetland forest for carbon storage potential? Like which one's better? That could go to either of you, I guess, or.
Gabriel, I'm guessing that's in your wheelhouse.
I'd have to look. I can't answer that off the top of my head. I'm not quite sure, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, we can.
One thing I'll say is, what makes Minnesota carbon stocks disproportionately high is it's the peat soils. It's these, black spruce forests. And so that's a in terms of carbon stocks, that's kind of our largest resource. So I know that there's a lot of, there's a large kind of science monitoring project underway looking at peat soils. And So in regards to, carbon stocks, I think, at least I can speak for Minnesota, 75% of them reside in our peat soils. So in these kind of, black ash sands. So if I can kind of provide some insight.
Okay, great. And then I think we have time for one more question. So how can I purchase the spiral guide and scorecard document?
No cost for either of those. They are free resources. Nikki, I can't remember. Did I send you a box of these field guides?
I think we have a few, but we're dwindling down. So.
Okay. So Judy, maybe you could contact Nikki if you want a hard copy, or Nikki, if you're running out, then I'd be happy to mail you some more.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, so we are at 2:31. So that concludes the webinar for today. And I just want to say thank you all for joining, and also to our speakers, and have a great week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep, thank you very much.